Hello, and welcome to today's conversation on building whole-of-society resilience here at the NATO Public Forum. I'm your host, Shanthi Kalathil, and I'm joined today by Deputy Secretary of Commerce, Don Graves, and Deputy Homeland Security Advisor and Deputy Assistant to the President, Durkovich. So glad to be having this conversation with you both. I thought we would kick it off by talking a little bit about what resilience means. I think that's a word that we've heard quite a bit over the last few days. A lot of people have brought it into conversations about security, about people, about communities, and yet we sometimes don't exactly know what that means, especially when we bring it outside of the context of individual resilience. So let me ask you both, what does resilience mean to you? How do you think of it in the context of a government, in the context of a nation, and also in the context of a community? So maybe, Caitlin, let's start with you.
Great, thank you. And first of all, Shanthi, it's great to be with you. Deputy Secretary Graves, always wonderful to share the stage with you. I think resilience really at the end of the day is about how you respond when things don't go as planned. And you can pull that string through all of those different sectors, through government, through society, and through your personal lives. We actually have an official definition that we use in our policy documents now, and it's about the ability to prepare for threats and hazards, to adapt to changing conditions, and to withstand and recover rapidly from those conditions and those disruptions. Essential to all of that is how society responds to unplanned events and the need to work at the individual level to make sure that our citizens are equally prepared for those unanticipated events. I think a big part of this, again, is what you're going to do when something occurs that you hadn't planned for. And so we are working across the federal community to make sure that our citizens think about what they need to do to help in the overall effort to be resilient. What you can do as individuals to make sure at home you have the necessary supplies on hand if you have to be on your own without assistance for a while, but also how you as an individual can contribute to that in terms of what you might bring to a fight.
Oh, that sounds great. And Deputy Secretary?
Well, Shanthi, thank you for hosting this conversation, and I'm never going to disagree with my friend Caitlin here. I would just add that the President has said that part of resiliency is recognizing the need for us to free ourselves from the dangerous dependencies that we currently have. We saw what happened in the pandemic when we weren't as resilient as we probably should have been. It's important to continue our having the connections in this very globally connected world, building off of our partnerships, but it's also building our own resiliency here at home and, of course, with our partners and allies. We have seen with the emergence of critical and emerging technologies, there's going to be an even greater need for a range of underlying technologies, the components, the equipment that goes into that, whether that's for our businesses or for people to be able to take care of themselves at home. So for us, it's about making sure that we have access to the technologies, having access to the needed goods, so that in the event that we have some type of challenging problem facing the country or the world, that our people are prepared and that we're not beholden to outside forces or those who might, for more nefarious purposes, hold us hostage.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think we can all agree that the way that you framed it, resilience is a very good thing, but it's one thing to talk about it as a theory, another thing to put it into practice. So from your respective perches, how do you go about putting resilience into practice?
So for us, I mean, we are a very large department at the Department of Commerce. And so we think about things like climate change and dealing with weather and the types of hazards and events that can affect communities, can affect regions, can affect parts of the globe. So we're certainly spending a lot of time thinking about how we build more resiliency, more access to information, predictive capabilities, and the like. It's why the President we were so excited when the President was able to pass the Inflation Reduction Act. It gave us more of the tools that we need to disseminate information, because information is one of those critical tools that you need to be more resilient. But it's also about having the infrastructure, the foundation, and foundational access to some of these tools, things like semiconductors. So we passed this thing called the CHIPS and Science Act, which gave us the ability to invest tens of billions of dollars in onshoring and friendshoring more of these needed critical technologies around semiconductors. So building a more resilient ecosystem is also part of what I think is vital to our overall resilience. When you have an ecosystem that is healthy, when you have multiple communities across the country that have businesses and universities that are innovating, that are driving the development of those fundamental technologies, it allows us to be able to prepare for any sort of eventuality and ensure that we and our partners and allies around the world aren't, again, stuck in a place where we don't have access to things like chips, which means that whole industries have to shut down at times because they don't have enough of them.
Sure. Caitlin.
Shanthi, that's a great question. And in fact, the president in late April signed out a new policy on critical infrastructure security and resilience, recognizing that the complex risk environment demands that we not only think about how we protect and secure our infrastructure, but that we need to bring that concept of resilience to it. Key to that is the notion that we have to be focused both on today's threats, but we also have to be attuned to what's out there on the horizon, right? That's that anticipatory piece that I talked about earlier. And so as part of the policy, the Secretary of Homeland Security has actually issued some strategic guidance to the federal government, those departments and agencies that are responsible for working with the owners and operators of critical infrastructure to help them manage the risk, about the things that they should be thinking about out in the future. That includes new technologies like artificial intelligence and both the opportunities they present, but how they can be weaponized. It includes thinking about the threat from the People's Republic of China and other nation states, and how we work to address both the cyber threat vectors that they use, but other hybrid threats. It includes thinking about the risk of the climate crisis and what that means for our communities. And then again, our increasing dependence on space and space-based assets and how we factor that in. And so each of the federal departments and agencies that work with industries are responsible for coming up now with a risk assessment of their sectors and then a plan for how we are going to strengthen the security and the resilience of those assets and systems and networks that make up that sector. So it's a whole of government, whole of society approach with a very aggressive timeline, because we, again, recognize that the risk environment that we are in is becoming more fraught and more complex, and it demands that we do a better job anticipating. I'm going to just say one more piece to this. What has really always been central to our critical infrastructure policy is information sharing. It is the cornerstone. It is providing those that are on the front lines with the information, the analytics, the intelligence that they need to make informed decisions about where to make investments. And that's one of the key pieces of this new policy, is the direction the president has given to the intelligence community to treat the private sector as a key customer and to understand what information they need, their intelligence requirements, again, so we can do a better job giving them tools to manage the risk.
And, you know, this new policy, National Security Memorandum 22, how are the departments and agencies implementing this? How is the Department of Commerce going about implementing this new policy?
Well, the great thing for us is that the policy is very explicit, giving us a number of tasks as it relates to fulfilling the mission. Broadly, it's everything that Caitlin just talked about. It's tackling the latest challenges, potential challenges to our national security around the development of a range of technologies. So we at the Commerce Department think about the development of standards for things like, and guardrails and protections, things like AI. my view is that for us to take advantage of all the wonderful innovations that life-changing innovations that AI can bring to the world, we have to lead with two core principles, and that's safety and security. We have to think about the science as well. So the safety and security, we have to have standards that ensure that that our partners in the private sector know exactly how far they can and should go, and that we're also thinking about how quickly the science will develop. The challenge that we have is that there are a lot of actors out there coming from a range of vectors who are looking to use these new technologies to maybe do things to us that we can't even imagine as of yet. So for us, it's about working with our partners in the private sector, working with the universities, and developing these standards, these protocols. It's why we stood up the AI Safety Institute at the Department of Commerce to specifically look at the ways that we build guardrails and approaches that give companies the transparency, the clarity, the predictability that they need so that they can continue to innovate and come up with new approaches that will change our world for the better, but also protects us against all of the potential downsides that technology like AI could bring.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you brought up technology, and Caitlin, you mentioned hybrid threats. I'd like to expand on that a little bit more. I think, obviously, with emerging technology, that can be a critical asset for us in building resilience, but it also can be a boon for our adversaries, and particularly when we get to hybrid threats, which can attack not only our infrastructure, but really the fabric of our democratic societies, really going after our democratic processes. There's an expanding threat landscape now. So how do you think about these issues? How do you think about this issue of hybrid threats, and especially bringing in this concept of new technology, of AI, and the ways that it can both perhaps help mitigate, but also, perhaps give fuel to some of these new threats? Caitlin, you want to start us off?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we certainly have moved beyond an era of where we are, solely focused on kinetic threats. One of the overarching or primary drivers of the new policy that I talked about, NSM 22, is the reality that our adversaries have actually made footholds into our infrastructure, largely through the cyber threat vector, which will enable, in a time of escalating tensions, for them to disrupt our ability to project force, to cause discord in our society, doubts in our ability to respond. So this is one example of how hybrid threats are playing out, and certainly an illustration that we are no longer protected by the oceans on our east and west, and our partners to the north and south, and something that we have to think about. But increasingly as well, we are worried about how information is used as a weapon to do similar things. And one of the things that I have in my portfolio is actually disinformation and misinformation, something that we worked very closely on. And we have seen how disinformation can impact almost every mission that the federal government is responsible for, from disaster response to now we're in the 2024 election cycle, and increasingly worried not just about disinformation around voting, but also the use of generative AI, or what's known as deep fakes, where somebody can easily manipulate an image, a video, or create a video or audio of a candidate, for example, that is fake, and convey either improper or wrong information, or convey something that may not be true about the time and place and nature of voting. And so these are an example of how hybrid threats are playing out in our environment, again, with the intent of disrupting or preying on vulnerable and maybe unwitting individuals to have a broader kind of strategic impact.
Yeah, please go ahead.
And I think the key to this is making sure that we're getting to the points of potential critical failure in our overall system. our biggest companies and our government agencies spend a lot of time, a lot of resources focusing on the biggest challenges to our critical infrastructure, to their systems. The problem that we have as a society, and I think this is across not just the United States, but all across the globe, is that the vulnerabilities exist within our supply chains. They exist within our key nodes across local communities, our small and mid-sized businesses, individuals who don't have the wherewithal, don't have the resources, don't have the full understanding of the nature of the challenge that we're facing. It's why we have our Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, as well as our Institute for Cybersecurity Education, which is meant as a counterpart to everything that the Department of Homeland Security is doing, that CISA is doing, making sure that the private sector and our partners all across the country, as well as American citizens, have the tools that they need to deal with this burgeoning challenge that we face. So it's certainly cybersecurity, but to your point, it's also AI. So more education is needed on all of this so that people are more aware of the threats that are coming at them that they may not even be aware about.
Yeah, I think one of the points you made, Caitlin, about the threats and deepfakes and new types of information that may be manipulated. One thing to keep in mind is sometimes people may lose faith altogether and stop believing in things because they're hearing so much about these threats that it actually destroys trust in institutions even further. And that's, I think, something that I'm really glad to hear that the government's thinking about. I think we've been talking a lot about resilience from a U.S. context, but these threats that we're talking about, building resilience, it's not something that stops at the borders, right? I mean, it's something with which we should be working with our partners and allies. So talk a little bit about how resilience can be shared, how it can be built collectively. What have we been doing to work with our partners and allies and those overseas to build our shared resilience? Caitlin, I know you've gone through some work on this front recently. If you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, let me just go back quickly to the building resilience piece, especially to disinformation. I think that government is not the only answer to this, by the way. This really is a whole of society effort, and that our education system, that our civil society needs, and our partners in all of this, frankly. And for the very reason that you said, there are parts of the public that do not trust in large institutions and governments, and so we have to use every available mean to help our citizenry better understand how this threat is evolving and how we build resilience. And I always say, when I was taught at some point in my life when you walk into a supermarket and you see a tabloid magazine in some false headline about a famous person having 8 alien children, well, someone along the way taught you that that was not true and to question that. And that's the same approach that we have to take when we build resilience to disinformation, but it's not only a government mission or effort. Related to how we are doing this with our partners, I think this is where there is a really good news story, and that we have many our allies and partners that are have been thinking about resilience for some time, and they may be challenged by different threats and hazards. And many, I think, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has also both helped inspire how resilience can be used to counter a threat, but why we need to continue to be focused on building it. I happen to serve as the U.S. Senior Resilience Officer at NATO, and every one of the member countries has a Senior National Resilience Officer. There is a committee that is focused on both the need to drive resilience at home, and so there's some baseline principles that are largely around how we strengthen our infrastructure to enable our society to be more resilient, our economy to be more resilient, but a recognition that a strong national resilience will also mean a stronger alliance. should we ever have to invoke Article 5 and mobilize forces, that the ability to withstand how adversaries may try and disrupt that force projection and our societal resilience. If we're stronger at home, we're stronger as an alliance. We, in May, actually brought all those senior national resilience officers here to Washington, and we did a series of exercises that were focused on some of the hybrid threats that we were talking about, cyber attacks coupled with disinformation and how we would respond, and had conversations about both the strengths that we have to address and mitigate those threats, but where we had gaps nationally, but also collectively where we could work together. A big piece of this is the communication piece, right? And thinking about upfront. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that we work on collectively together is the threat of what we call space weather, but that's the sun emanating solar flares, and we're in a kind of period of enhanced solar activity where we've actually seen a lot of space weather. We know more and more about how a strong storm could impact the functioning of our infrastructure. And it's changed over time because we have become such a digitized and electrified society. Well, instead of waiting for the big storm to happen and then trying to figure out who's going to be the expert and what our messages are going to be and how we communicate to the public about what a solar event or a space weather event is and isn't, we're trying to do all of that work on drafting the messaging and identifying who our experts are going to be now. So we're in the thick of a response. We're not trying to pull all of this together. And I think more and more how we communicate and message to our citizenry is really important, and we have to put a lot of time and effort into thinking about it, given the very kind of fractured information environment that we live in.
What were some of the findings that came out about information sharing and communication among allies and partners from that exercise? I mean, you both have mentioned that that's really of preeminent importance. Were there any interesting insights that came out from that?
I think, one of the takeaways, and this often happens I shouldn't say often, but in most exercises, everyone agrees that we have to do a better job sharing information. And I think this is where NATO has a strong history of doing that on the defensive front, and we need to think about how we build that same kind of institutional capacity on the resilience front. One of the things, though, that we remain concerned about is, and whether it is a weather event, a solar event, or our adversaries disrupting it, is what happens when you don't have reliable communications. And that there is intermittent or disrupted comms. That is going to challenge all of us, and it is something that we are working on here in the United States to build resiliency and to think about, all right, if commercial communications isn't available, how are we going to function and operate in a degraded environment? But we also have to do it with our partners and allies overseas.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, the way that I think about this, and I know the president has long said this, NATO has been the bulwark in the defense of democratic values for 70 years. And that's really what this is all about, is thinking about how we ensure the protection, the uplift of our shared values. Some of that is on the kinetic side, the national security side, but some of that is also on the infrastructure side and on the economic side. And one of the best examples of the ways that we can make this work more effectively going forward is what we did, as Caitlin mentioned, with the unwarranted invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We were able, in very short order, I remember having the video calls with my counterparts in the EU and across the globe, where we were able to pull together in a matter, it felt like just a number of weeks, a coalition of partners that took unprecedented action, imposing export controls and sanctions on Russia to prevent Putin's war machine from doing even more damage than it's already done. he is paying a very heavy price, continuing to lack the access to the most advanced technologies. And so it's that type of concerted, coordinated action that partners and allies do together that I think can be most effective in the type of environment that we're in today. So I think that going forward, the more that we can share what we're seeing, we can coordinate on the development of standards and approaches so that we can protect the type of world economic order and that is, I think, of value to all of the NATO partners, to all of our allies and partners. It allows us to have the type of security and resilience that will protect all of our people, whether it's from kinetic harm or from the type of hybrid types of attacks that we're seeing much more of in recent years.
And I know we're running out of time, but I did want to ask one last question, which I think gets back to the title of this session about building whole of society resilience. So how do you envision that the private sector can work with the U.S. government, with other governments to help build that whole of society resilience? And also, how do you bring society into this? How do you bring civil society and publics into this question so that you do get to this whole of society piece?
So it's exactly what we've been doing. And I think this applies to the work that we do with our partners and allies, but I'll focus here at home. When we're implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law, for instance, we have a Internet for All program that is building resilience so that, going back to the pandemic, you're not in a place where your kids can't get access to the education that they need because you don't have high-speed internet, or your parents who may be elderly and need to get access to telehealth don't have the ability to reach their doctor. That's a sort of investment in infrastructure that is going to be absolutely vital for our long-term resilience. But we can't do that ourselves. This is one where we are investing in and with the private sector. We're utilizing civil society to help us develop the approaches to build coalitions so that we're getting this just right. It has to be a whole of society approach because when any of these various actors try to go it alone, invariably you're going to miss something. So for us, we have to make sure that we're communicating, that we're sharing, that we're getting feedback, we're taking that feedback in, and then we're acting accordingly. And I think that's the approach that's going to be very successful in building our resilience for the long term.
Thank you.
This is where I think we have a good news story in this country, and that the private sector has been part of this critical infrastructure partnership since the very beginning of our policy, our national policy around critical infrastructure protection, which was first promulgated when Bill Clinton was president in 1998. And they are essential to how we think about the security and resilience of our infrastructure, because at the end of the day, they own and operate most of it, and they manage the risk. And so that partnership, that voluntary partnership, has been, again, instrumental to how we have, over the course of the last 25 years, helped develop a strong and robust and reliable infrastructure ecosystem that has powered the economy and the world that we know today. I think increasingly we recognize that the voluntary aspect of it may have outlived its usefulness, and that we do need to do more to drive standards and regulation, especially in those sectors where there isn't it. So we make sure that there is a minimum baseline of security and resilience practices that industry is following. We are bringing a lot of the lessons learned of our critical infrastructure partnership to NATO and having conversations about how we actually bring industry to the table, much like NATO has on the defense side, how we think about it in the resilience context, and bringing, again, those key captains of industry to the conversation. I will say that is part of the exercise that we did in May, and I think this is one of the most important things that we can do, is that we have to be clear-eyed with the public, with our citizenry, about what is out there on the horizon, and that is part of what will help build resilience. And that's not just government at the federal level, but at the state and local level. That's our civil society leaders and faith-based organizations. We are I think, being forthright about what we're anticipating to happen here at the federal level in the next 3 to 5 years, and we have to make sure that our citizens understand that, and that that message needs to be consistent across partners and allies, and that is what will help drive resilience. If we are open with the American people about what we see out there on the horizon, I think that will help drive societal resilience and what we expect of them in a time of crisis.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I'm sure we could all talk a lot more about this subject, and I anticipate that the themes of resilience are going to echo throughout the rest of the discussions here at the Public Forum. But I'd like to thank both of you for joining us here. It's been a great conversation. Thank you very much to the NATO Public Forum, and thank you very much to the online audience for joining us.